Good morning, everybody. How are we all doing? Welcome back to the Funky Bunch at Sunday Brunch Podcast, where we are still going over different video game genres and their many subgenres. The goal for today is for us to actually finish up the RPG role-playing video game genre. We've got to finish up the roguelike subgenre and then do the tactical role-playing subgenre. So, to start off, let's do a quick recap on what a role-playing video game is. Role-playing video games draw their gameplay from traditional tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons. Most of these games cast the player in the role of a character that grows in strength and experience over the course of the game. By overcoming difficult challenges and or defeating monsters, the player gains experience points, which represent the character's progress in a chosen profession or class, such as melee combat or ranged magic spells, and allow the player to gain new abilities once a set amount are obtained. Many RPGs contain an open world known as an overworld, which is usually populated with monsters that allow access to other, more important game locations such as towns, dungeons, and castles. Since the emergence of affordable home computers coincided with the popularity of paper and pencil role-playing games, this genre was one of the first in video games and continues to be popular today. Gameplay elements strongly associated with RPGs, such as statistical character development through the acquisition of experience points, have been widely adapted to other genres, such as action-adventure games. Though nearly all of the entries in the genre were turn-based games, many modern role-playing games progress in real time. Thus, the genre has followed the strategy games trend of moving from turn-based to real-time combat. The move to real-time combat began with the release of Square Enix's Final Fantasy IV, which was the first of the game series to use the ATB or Active Time Battle system. This was quickly followed by truly real-time action role-playing games in such series as the Mana series, the Soul Blazer series, and Ultima 7. Although older turn-based systems still exist, like the Golden Sun series or the Pokemon series, that tends to be the downward trend and may eventually disappear. Alright, now that we did the overview, let us jump immediately into the roguelike. We were going over the history, and we're currently on Mystery Dungeon Games, 1993 on. So, through 1993, roguelikes primarily existed in computer space, and no home console variants had yet existed. Two of the earliest known attempts were Sega's Fatal Labyrinth, 1990, and Dragon Crystal, 1990, but which lacked the depth of a typical computer-based roguelike. Neither proved to be successful games. Chunsoft had gained success by developing the Dragon Quest series, a series which established fundamental aspects of the computer role-playing game genre, popular for Western computer audiences, and to a more streamlined approach better suited for Japanese players that preferred console. With roguelikes starting to gain popularity, Chunsoft's developers believed they could do a similar treatment for that genre to make it better suited for Japanese audiences. Chunsoft's Koichi Nakamura stated their intent was to take Rogue and make it more understandable, more easy to play version of the title that could be played on consoles. This led to the creation of the Mystery Dungeon, with the first title being Torneko no Daiboken Fushigi no Dungeon, or Torneko's Great Adventure Mystery Dungeon 1993, based on the Dragon Quest series. Several changes to the roguelike formula had to be made to make for this conversion. They had developed ways to reduce the difficulty of the roguelike by using progressively more difficult dungeons that were randomly generated, and made permadeath only an option by selection of the difficulty level. An added benefit of Torneko no Daiboken was that it used the established Dragon Quest IV setting and the character Torneko, helping to make the game familiar to its planned audience and giving a story for the player to follow. While Torneko no Daiboken did not sell as well as the typical Dragon Quest games, it was successful enough for Chunsoft to develop a second title based on a wholly original character and setting, or Mystery Dungeon Shiren the Wanderer, which was released in 1995. Chunsoft found that they were more creative with how they developed the game without the need to respect an existing property. Since then, Chunsoft has developed over 25 games in the Mystery Dungeon series for various platforms. In addition to their Shiren titles, many of the other Chunsoft Mystery Dungeon games span various franchises, including a Chocobo series based on Final Fantasy, the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series based on Pokemon, and a crossover with Atlus's Etrian Odyssey and Etrian Mystery Dungeon. Several titles in the Mystery Dungeon series were popular and would become a staple of the Japanese video game market. So, a primary difference between the Mystery Dungeon games and Western roguelikes, following the Berlin interpretation, is the lack of permadeath. In a Mystery Dungeon game, the player character may die or become too injured, which resets their progress to the start of the dungeon, but the game typically provides means to store and recover equipment and other items from previous runs. The mystery games were not as successful in the Western markets when published there, as the target players, which were younger players who likely had not experienced games like Rogue, found the lack of a traditional role-playing game save system odd. Other Japanese role-playing games would incorporate random dungeon generation as part of their design, mimicking part of the nature of roguelikes, and were considered roguelike titles when published in the Western markets. Such titles include Vagrant Story, Shining Soul, and Baroque. The MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV added a randomly generated deep dungeon that was inspired by the procedural generation of roguelikes. So, the continued develop within the Western market. So, 2002 onward. So, we've jumped another 9 years. So, though new classical roguelike variants would continue to be developed within the Western market, the genre languished as more advanced personal computers capable of improved graphic capabilities in games that utilize these features became popular. However, some of these new graphical games drew influence for roguelike concepts, notably action role-playing games like Blizzard Entertainment's Diablo. Diablo's creator, David Brevik, acknowledged that games like Rogue, NetHack, Telengrad, and other roguelikes influenced the design of Diablo, including the nature of randomly generated dungeons and loot. Existing roguelikes continued to be developed. A sequel to Adam successfully received crowdfunding in 2012, while NetHack's first major release in 10 years in 2015 is set to help the dev team expand the game further. New roguelikes that adhere to core Berlin interpretation rules are still being created. Excuse me. Including Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup, Dungeons of Dreadmore, and Dragonfin Soup. A subclass of coffee break roguelikes that could be completed in a short period of time have developed, often derived from the entries in the 7-day roguelike challenge. Examples include Doom RL and Desktop Dungeons. Some games would also take advantage of the ease of developing in the tile-based ASCII interfaces common to roguelikes. For example, the highly popular Dwarf Fortress uses the roguelike interface atop a construction and management simulation, and would serve as a major inspiration for Minecraft, while Sanctuary RPG is a more traditional turn-based role-playing game featuring a scripted story that uses an ASCII interface and roguelike gameplay elements. Unreal World, the game that is considered to be the forerunner of all survival game genres, and which frequently use procedural generation to create worlds that players would survive in, was developed by Sami Maranen and was influenced by roguelikes, with its initial interface being similar to that of NetHack. And then the last topic we're going to hit is the growth of the roguelike, which is from 2005 onward. So the roguelike genre saw a resurgence in Western markets after 2000 through independent developers who created a new subgenre designating the roguelite, though the games are sometimes simply just called the roguelike-likes. Indie developers began to incorporate roguelike elements into genres not normally associated with roguelikes, crafting games that would form the basis of this new subgenre. Two of the earliest cited examples of roguelites are Strange Adventures in Infinite Space and its sequel, Weird Worlds Return to Infinite Space by Digital Eel, both exploration of space games that included randomly generated panels and encounters. Also permadeath. Digital Eel based their work on the space exploration game Starflight, along with roguelikes like NetHack, but wanted to provide a shorter experience that would be easier to replay, akin to tabletop beer and pretzel games like Death Maze and The Sorcerer's Cave, that has elements in common with roguelikes. Spelunky released shortly after the formation of the Berlin Interpretation, and is considered to be a major contribution to the growth of indie-developed roguelites. Spelunky was developed by Derek Yu, who wanted to take the deep gameplay that is offered by roguelikes and combine it with the ease and pick-up play of a platformer. This result was a platform game incorporating the notion of permadeath, in which the player takes an explorer through randomly generated caves. The intent was to create deep gameplay in which the game could be replayed over and over again, with randomly generated situations driving the need for the player to develop novel, emergent strategies on the fly. Developer Jason Rohrer stated that Spelunky totally revamped my thinking about single-player video game design. The formula and success of both Weird Worlds and Spelunky would influence other developers in creating new roguelites. Edmund McMillan, the developer of The Binding of Isaac, and Kenny and Teddy Lee, the co-developers of Rogue Legacy, credit Yu's approach with Spelunky as showing how to distill down the nature of the traditional roguelike. The traditional roguelike to apply it to other gaming genres, which they had done for their roguelites. Justin Ma and Matthew Davis, the co-developers of FTL, Faster Than Light, credited both Weird Worlds, Return to Infinite Space, and Spelunky as part of their influence for FTL. All of these games earned critical praise, and their successes led to more modern resurgence in roguelites since their release. The newfound success in roguelites is considered part of a larger trend in those that play both board and computer games looking for rich play experiences, as described by 100 Rogues developer Keith Bergen. More popular titles may not always offer. David Bamgort and Gaslamp Games stated that there is a thrill of the risk inherent in roguelites with random generation and permadeath, helping the player become more invested in the fate of their player character. The deadly precariousness inherent to the unknown environments of roguelikes gives that investment a great deal of meaning. Additionally, many of these newer roguelites strive to address the apparent high difficulty and ruthlessness that traditional roguelikes were known for. And newer players will be able to find more help through user-generated game guides, walkthroughs, and other things that are made possible through the wide internet access. Fabian Fisher offers that players have taken to independently developed roguelikes as they have tired from superficial gameplay, whitewashing spectacle, the content craze, and Skinner box design in titles produced by AAA developers and publishers. Particularly for smaller indie developers, the nature of the procedurally generated world allows teams to deliver many hours worth of game content without having to spend resources and development time on fleshing out detailed worlds. This also allows developers to devote more time in building out complex gameplay features and their interacting systems that are part of the enjoyment of roguelike and roguelite games. McMillan of The Binding of Isaac stated that incorporating roguelike elements into other game genres can be difficult due to overcoming the complex interfaces roguelikes tend to have. But once a means to do so is found, it becomes an increasingly beautiful, deep, and everlasting design that allows you to generate a seemingly dynamic experience for players, so that each time they play your game, they're getting a totally new adventure. Examples of successful games that have generated roguelike components into other genres include Dead Cells, which is a roguelike incorporated with Metroidvania style of platform games, Slay the Spire, which brings the roguelike progression to a deck-building game, Crypt of the Necrodancer, which uses a rhythm game style approach to a roguelike dungeon, and Enter the Gungeon, which establishes a roguelike progression in a shoot-'em-up. Hades, a roguelike action role-playing game, was built to strongly incorporate elements of nonlinear narrative into the game, giving the reason for the player to continually delve into replaying the game, and helped to draw in players to the roguelike genre that otherwise had to be put off by its high difficulty level before. Oh gosh, those yawns. My apologies. All right. And that, of course, leaves us with the very last factor for us to consider in the RPG genre, which is the tactical role-playing game subgenre. Let me grab a quick sip of this coffee. Delicious. Okay. Tactical role-playing games, abbreviated as TRPG, are a genre of video games which combines core elements of traditional role-playing video games with that of tactical games. The format of a tactical RPG video game is much like a traditional tabletop role-playing game in its appearance, pacing, and rule structure. Likewise, early tabletop role-playing games are descended from skirmish wargames like Chainmail, which were primarily concerned with combat. So the game design. The subgenre of role-playing video games principally refers to games which incorporate elements from strategy video games as an alternative to traditional role-playing game systems. Like standard RPGs, the player typically controls a finite party and battles a similar number of enemies. And like other RPGs, death is usually temporary, but this genre incorporates strategic gameplay such as tactical movement on an isometric grid. Unlike traditional RPGs, which are traditionally single-player, some tactical RPGs feature multiplayer play, such as Final Fantasy Tactics. A distinct difference between tactical RPGs and traditional RPGs is the lack of exploration. For instance, Final Fantasy Tactics does away with the third-person exploration of towns and dungeons that is typical in a Final Fantasy game. And Final Fantasy Tactics, instead of exploration, there's an emphasis on battle strategy. Players are able to build and train characters to use in battle, utilize different classes, which include warriors and magic users, which is really dependent on the game. Characters normally gain experience points from battle and grow stronger. They are awarded secondary experience points, which can be used to advance within their specific character classes. Battles have specific win conditions, such as defeating all enemies or surviving a certain number of turns, that the player must accomplish before the next map will become available. And between battles, players can access their characters to equip them, change their class, train them, and more, really depending on the type of game. All right. And then there's a very, very long history of the tactical role-playing. So let's jump into it. A number of early role-playing video games use a tactical form of combat, such as Tunnels of Doom, 1982, and Ultima 3 Exodus, 1983, as well as The Dragon Princess, 1982, and Bokosuka Wars, 1983, which introduced party-based tiled combat to America and Japan, respectively. Further, tactical RPGs are descendants of tabletop role-playing games and war games such as Dungeons & Dragons and Chainmail, which were mainly tactical in their original form. Nonetheless, much of the development of tactical RPGs has diverged on each side of the Pacific, and the term tactical RPG is sometimes reserved only for those titles that were created in Japan. So, the 8-bit origins in the East, 1982 to 1990. One of the earliest Japanese RPGs is Koei's The Dragon and Princess, released on the NEX PC 8001 home computer platform in 1982. This game can also be considered a precursor to the tactical RPG genre. It used a combat system where, following a random encounter, the game transitioned to a separate graphical overhead battle screen and tactical turn-based combat ensued. That same year, in 1982, Tunnels of Doom used a similar combat system as did Ultima 3 Exodus, which was released in 1983. During the 8-bit era, Bokosuka Wars, a computer game developed by Koji Sumi for the Sharp X1 in 1983 and ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System by ASCII in 1985, was responsible for laying the foundations for the tactical RPG genre, or simulation RPG genre as it is known in Japan, with its blend of role-playing and strategy game elements. The game revolves around a king who must recruit soldiers and lead his army against overwhelming enemy forces, while each unit gains experience and levels up along the way. It is also considered to be an early prototype real-time strategy game. Another notable early example of the genre was Kure Software Kobu's 1988 PC 8801 strategy RPG Silver Ghost, which was cited by Camelot Software Planning's Hiroyuki Takahashi as inspiration for the Shining series of tactical RPGs. According to Takahashi, Silver Ghost was a simulation action type of game where you had to direct, oversee, and command multiple characters. Unlike later tactical RPGs, however, Silver Ghost was not turn-based, but instead used real-time strategy and action role-playing game elements. It also featured a point-and-click interface to control the characters using a cursor. A similar game released by Kure Software Kobu that same year was First Queen, a unique hybrid between a real-time strategy action RPG and a strategy RPG. Like an RPG, the player can explore the world, purchase items, and level up. And like a strategy video game, it focuses on recruiting soldiers and fighting against large armies rather than small parties. The game's Gochyakarya, or multiple characters, system let the player control one character at a time while the others are controlled by computer AI that follow the leader. And where battles are large-scale, where characters sometimes fill the entire screen. Master of Monsters, developed by System Soft and released in 1989 for the MSX2, added fantasy characters and magic attacks to the gameplay of the wartime combat Daisenryaku series, which had instead opted for tanks, planes, and other vehicles of real-world modern combat. Master of Monsters also added an experience bar for the character units, concept which would be adapted and popularized by later console-based series like Fire Emblem. Unlike many earlier titles in the genre, Master of Monsters made its way to the West via a port to the Sega Genesis in 1991, albeit only in North America. However, the genre did not become prolific until Nintendo published the game that set a template for tactical war game RPGs, Fire Emblem Ankoku Ryu to Hikari no Tsurugi. Developed by Intelligent Systems and released exclusively in Japan for the Nintendo Famicom in 1990, Fire Emblem would become an archetype for the whole genre, establishing gameplay elements that are still used in tactical RPGs today, though many of these elements were influenced by earlier RPGs and strategy games. Combining the basic concepts from games like Dragon Quest and simple turn-based strategy elements that the development team gained experience with in their 1988 release Famicom Wars, Intelligent Systems created a hit which spawned many sequels and imitators. It introduced unique features, such as how the characters were not interchangeable pawns, but each of them were unique in terms of both class and stats, and how a character who runs out of hit points would usually remain dead forever, unless they have plot armor. The later mechanic was used to introduce a non-linear storyline to the genre, where different multiple endings are possible depending on which characters are alive or dead. A concept still used in recent games such as Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor and Final Promise Story. However, it was not until the release of Fire Emblem Reika no Ken for the Game Boy Advance many years later that the series was introduced to Western gamers, who until then were more familiar with localized precursors like Nobunaga's Ambition, as well as later tactical RPGs partially influenced by Fire Emblem, including the Shining and Ogre series and Final Fantasy Tactics, and Nippon Ichi's game like Disgaea. I don't know. Eastern console history, 1991 to present. The 16-bit consoles. During the 16-bit generation, among the first imitators was Langrisser by NCS Messiah First released for the Mega Drive Genesis in 1991. It was translated for North America release and retitled War Song. The Langrisser series differed from Fire Emblem in that it used a general soldier structure instead of controlling main characters. Langrisser 2 spawned many sequels, none of which were brought to North America. Langrisser set itself apart from other tactical RPGs in its time with larger scale battles where the player could control over 30 units at one time and fight against scores of enemies. Since Der Langrisser in 1994, the series offered non-linear branching paths and multiple endings. The player's choices and actions affected which of the 4 different paths they followed, either aligning themselves with one of 3 different factions or fighting against all of them. Each of the 4 paths leads to a different ending, and there are over 75 possible scenarios. Langrisser 3 introduced a relationship system similar to dating sims. Depending on the player's choices and actions, the feelings of the female allies will change towards the player character, who will end up with the female ally he is closest with. Master of Monsters was a unique title by Systemsoft, where Langrisser and Fire Emblem uses a square-based grid. Master of Monsters uses a hexagonal grid. Players could choose one of 4 different lords to defend their towers and areas on the grid by building an army of creatures to destroy the opposing army. This game had a sequel to the PlayStation called Master of Monsters Disciple of Gaia, which had limited success and was criticized for its slow gameplay. Both Warsong and Master of Monsters were cited as inspirations behind the 2005 turn-based strategy computer RPG, The Battle of Wesnoth. The first game in the long-running Super Robot Wars series is another early example of the genre, which was initially released for the Game Boy in 1991. Another influential early tactical RPG was Sega's Shining Force for the Sega Genesis, which was released in 1992. Shining Force used even more console RPG elements than earlier games, allowing the player to walk around towns and talk to people and buy weapons. It spawned sequels such as Shining Force 2 for Sega Genesis and Shining Force CD for Sega CD. Besides the Shining Force Gaiden 1, 2, and 3 for Sega Game Gear and Shining Force 3 for the Sega Saturn. The game's creator, Camelot Software Planning's Hiroyuki Takahashi, cited Kure Software's Kobu 1988 tactile RPG Silver Ghost as his inspiration. One game released solely in Japan for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the SNES, Bahamut Lagoon, began Square's, now Square Enix's, famous line of tactical RPGs. 4 games from the Ogre Battle series have been released in North America. The first was Ogre Battle March of the Black Queen, which was released for the SNES in 1993, and was more of a real-time strategy RPG in which the player forms character parties that are moved around the map in real time. When 2 parties meet, the combat plays out with minimal user interaction. The game is notable for introducing a moral alignment system that not only affects the gameplay, but where tactical and strategic decisions influence the outcome of a non-linear branching storyline, which is affected by factors such as moral alignments of the troops used to liberate a city, whether to keep certain liberated cities guarded, making popular or unpopular decisions, concentrating power among just a few units, making deals with thieves, and a general sense of justice. These factors lead to one of 13 possible endings, alongside other factors such as how many and which units are used, how battles are fought, the army's reputation, the player character's alignment and charisma, and secrets discovered. The sequel, Tactics Ogre Let Us Cling Together, was originally a 1995 SNES game that was not released outside of Japan. It was later ported to the PlayStation, along with Ogre Battle March of the Black Queen. Both of the PlayStation re-releases were marketed in North America by Atlas, as was Ogre Battle 64, Person of Lordly Caliber, for the Nintendo 64. Tactic Ogre's gameplay is more similar to the genre of tactical RPG that Final Fantasy Tactics belongs to, which was developed by former members of Quest and credited, written, directed by Yasumi Matsuno, complete with battles taking place on isometric grids. It was also the first to bear the name tactics in the title, a term gamers would come to associate with the genre. Not only are characters moved individually on a grid, but the view is isometric, and the order of combat is calculated for each character individually. The game also expanded the non-linear alignment system of its predecessor, with 3 types of alignments for each unit: lawful, neutral, and chaos, neither of which are portrayed as necessarily good or bad. The game gives players the freedom to choose their own destiny with difficult moral choices, such as whether to follow a lawful path by upholding the order of loyalty and slaughter civilian non-player characters on the leader's command, or follow the chaotic path by following a personal sense of justice and rebelling, or instead following a more neutral path. Such factors affect the game's ending, which is also affected by decisions such as whether to obtain the most powerful class, which can only be acquired by making a tragic sacrifice. Another feature was Warren's Report, a type of database on the land, people, encounters, and races of Valeria, similar to, but much more expansive than, the Troves of Knowledge in Mass Effect. Although this game defined the genre in many ways, it was not widely recognized by American gamers because it was released to American audiences several years later. Final Fantasy Tactics shared staff members with Tactics Ogre and share many of its gameplay elements. A prequel to the original Tactics Ogre, The Knight of Lotus, was later released for the Game Boy Advance. A remake of Let Us Cling Together was later released for the PSP in 2011. In 1996, the tactical role-playing game Fire Emblem Saisen no Kefu also featured a non-linear branching storyline, but instead of using an alignment system, it used a relationship system resembling dating sims that gave players the ability to affect the relationship points between different unit characters. This in turn affected both the gameplay and the storyline, with different possible relationships in the first generation of the game's plot leading to different unit characters appearing during the second generation, ultimately leading to different possible outcomes in the storyline. So now we're at the 32-bit consoles in the East. The 32-bit era saw many influential tactical RPGs such as Konami's 1996 Vandal Heart series, which feature branching storylines that can be altered by players' dialogue choices that lead to different endings, as well as Sega's 1997 Shining Force 3 SCEI's Arc the Lad collection, 1996 to 1999, and Square's 1997 Final Fantasy Tactics and 1999 Front Mission 3. Konami's Vandal Hearts was an early PlayStation title that helped popularize tactical RPGs in the US. It was released by Konami and featured a 3D isometric map that could be rotated by the player. A sequel was subsequently released, also for the PlayStation, and Konami has announced a third title in the development for the Nintendo DS. One of the first 32-bit tactical RPGs, Guardian War, was developed by Micro Cabin and released in 1993 on the Panasonic 3DO. While the game lacked in story, it included many game mechanics that are seen throughout many of the 32-bit tactical RPGs, like isometric camera rotation, interchangeable and hybridization of jobs or classes for each character, the combination of moves between characters and the capture of NPCs and having them play on your side. Sega's Sakura Wars, released for the Sega Saturn in 1996, combined tactical RPG combat with dating sim and visual novel elements, introducing a real-time branching choice system where, during an event or conversation, the player must choose an action or dialogue choice within a time limit, or not to respond at all within that time limit. The player's choice, or lack of choice, affects the player character's relationship with other characters, and in turn, the character's performance in battle, the direction of the storyline, and the ending. Later games in the series added several variations, including an action gauge that can be raised up or down depending on the situation, and a gauge that the player can manipulate using the analog stick depending on the situation. The success of Sakura Wars led to a wave of games that combine the RPG and dating sim genres, including Thousand Arms in 1998, Riviera, The Promised Land in 2000, and Luminous Arc in 2007. Final Fantasy Tactics was arguably the most responsible for bringing tactical RPGs to North America. Developed by former employees of Quest, The developer responsible for the Ogre Battle series, it combined many elements of the Final Fantasy series with Tactics Ogre-style gameplay. It also expanded on the isometric grid combat of Tactics Ogre by allowing players to freely rotate the camera around the battlefield, rather than keeping the camera in a fixed position. The storyline of Final Fantasy Tactics was also more linear than its predecessor in order to provide a deeper, epic narrative. Thanks to Hiroyuki Ito, the lead designer on the game, it also successfully implemented a modified job system, which was previously used in Final Fantasy V, which allowed the player to change the unit's character class at any time during the game and learn new abilities from job points earned with each class. The game was acclaimed for both its highly tactical gameplay and its well-written storyline that touches on issues such as class privilege, religion, and politics. The game's reputation led to other developers adding the word tactics to their titles to indicate tactical RPG genre. It was later ported to the PSP as Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions, and is still regarded as one of the greatest tactical RPGs of all time. The 6th generation for the Eastern consoles. On 6th generation consoles, a loyal American fan base has been established by Nippon Ichi, makers of the PS2 games like La Pucelle, Tactics, Phantom Brave, and Disgaea, Hour of Darkness. Of these games, Disgaea has been the most successful to date, and was the second Nippon Ichi game released in North America, first being Rhapsody, a musical adventure, which was published by Atlus. Throughout this generation, companies have recognized the large audience and popularity of these types of games, particularly Atlus and Nintendo. La Pucelle, Tactics, and Disgaea Hour of Darkness, which Atlus re-released due to high demand, have become cult hits for the PlayStation 2. In 2001, Sakura Wars 3 for the Dreamcast introduced a new combat system that incorporates action elements, and abandons the use of grids in favor of allowing each character to move around freely across the battlefield. But with a limited number of moves, each illustrated using a bar at the bottom of the screen. This type of combat system would later be the basis for the combat system in Valkyrie Chronicles, developed by much of the same team in 2008. The Sakura Wars series would not be released in the West until the 5th game, Sakura Wars So Long, My Love, in 2005. The Front Mission series also continued on to the PlayStation 2 with Front Mission 4 and Front Mission 5, later of which never saw a Western release, but a fan translation instead. The Game Boy Advance would also see the release of Rebel Star Tactical Command 2005 by XCOM creators Nick and Julian Galop. The game would be highly praised by adapting the combat mechanics of a highly detailed and acclaimed PC strategy series, but also would receive criticism for subpar presentation, a lackluster storyline, and lack of link mode support. The game ended up giving an average score of 77.83% at Game Rankings. In early 2006, Idea Factory's Blazing Soul featured non-linear gameplay that allows the player to progress through the game and the story in whatever order they wish. In addition, instead of having separate screens or maps for exploration and battle, the game features a seamless transition between exploration and battle. This time period also saw the Western debut of Fire Emblem and Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade, simply titled Fire Emblem outside of Japan. And yes, I do agree. I've also heard of many of these games, but I've also seen them played as well, so I am familiar with the way that they're played. So I knew that they were this style, but I also didn't know anything about this style. I just knew that I didn't necessarily enjoy it that much, but I'm willing to give it a try, especially when we get through our replay of Final Fantasy. I want to jump into the tactics games, if possible. So, just so we can get our hands on some tactics gameplay, see, maybe we do really like it. Or maybe we don't. Alright, on to the 7th generation of the Eastern. On 7th generation consoles, Sega's Valkyrie Chronicles 2008 for the PS3 utilizes the 7th generation console processing power by using a distinctive anime watercolor art style. as well as incorporating third-person tactical shooter elements. After selecting a character in the overhead map view, the character manually controls him from a third-person view. This mechanic allows for, among others, free movement to a certain range, manually aiming with extra damage for headshots, a limited cover system, and real-time hazards such as interception fire and landmines. The game has been described as the missing link between Final Fantasy Tactics and Full Spectrum Warrior. In 2004, Konami released Metal Gear Acid, which combined the stealth game elements of the Metal Gear series with turn-based tactical RPG gameplay of games like Fire Emblem, Final Fantasy Tactics, and Disgaea, along with the random draw, forethought, and resource management appeal of card battles like Konami's own Yu-Gi-Oh! Games. Developer Kuju Entertainment released Dungeons & Dragons Tactics for the PSP in 2007. The game intended to adapt the rules and mechanics of the popular tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, but suffered from poor interface and an awkward camera control. The Atlas title Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor blended together both traditional and tactical RPG gameplay, along with non-linear adventure game elements. It also featured an innovative demon auction system and a death clock system where each character has a specified time of death, with the player's actions and choices having consequences on who lives and who dies. Infinite Space by Platinum Games for the Nintendo DS is a hybrid of tactical role-playing, real-time strategy, and space simulator elements, and features a non-linear branching narrative with numerous choices that can have dramatic consequences, and an epic scale spanning hundreds of planets. Radiant Historia, released by Atlas for the Nintendo DS in 2010, combined the gameplay of traditional RPG titles with a highly tactical grid combat system with several unique features such as a queue allowing party members to switch turns and perform combo attacks when near each other on the queue, and the manipulation of enemy positions by knocking a target onto another grid space and attack multiple targets when enemies fall onto the same grid space. The game is most notable for its unique take on the concept of nonlinear branching storylines, where it combines with concepts of time travel and parallel universes, expanding on the Chrono series. Radiant Historia takes it much further by giving players the freedom to travel backwards and forwards through a timeline to alter the course of history, with each of their choices and actions having a major effect on the timeline. The player can return to certain points in history and live through certain events again to make different choices and see different possible outcomes on the timeline. The player can also travel back and forth between two parallel timelines and see many possible parallel endings. Square Enix's PSP version of Tactic Ogre's Let Us Cling Together released around the same time, featuring a similar world system that allows players to revisit key plot points and make different choices to see how the story unfolds differently. Atlas title Grow Lancer 4, Wayfarer of Time, features a unique battle system that blends turn-based and real-time strategy. The player controls each character in turn, but the actions play out in real time. Image Epoch's upcoming Saigo no Yakusoku no Monogatari for the PSP has a strategic command battle-based battle system where enemies learn from previous skirmishes. The characters can also die permanently during gameplay, which in turn affects the game's storyline. And now we're looking at Western-developed games. So Western personal computers. Many Western PC games have utilized this genre for years as well. Western games tend to have a stronger military theme, without many of the fantasy elements often found in their console and mainly Japanese counterparts, as well as greater freedom of movement when interacting with the surrounding environment. Notable examples include Jagged Alliance series, 1994 to 2018, and the Silent Storm series, 2003 to 2005, with many titles owing considerably to the XCOM series of strategy games. In fact, Western PC games in the genre were largely defined by XCOM in much of the same way as Eastern console games were by Fire Emblem. So 1990s. Incubation, Time is Running Out. 1997. Part of the Battle Isle series, was one of the first strategy titles to use fully 3D graphics and support hardware acceleration on the 3DFX Voodoo. Other titles in the series are mainly tactical war games featuring vehicle combat and base capturing. the game was generally well received by critics. Gorky 17, 1999, is a tactical RPG by Polish developer Metropolis Software, featuring elements of survival horror. It was also the first title in the series featuring the main character Cole Sullivan. Later titles in the series were third-person shooters. The game's reception was mixed. Vantage Master is a series of tactical RPGs similar to Master of Monsters, developed and published by Nihon Falcom for Microsoft Windows beginning in 1997. The first game in the series was never released outside Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. The latest game, Vantage Master Portable, was announced for the PSP on December 20th, 2007, but was released in April of 2008. Jagged Alliance is a turn-based RPG series developed by Sir Tech Canada. First game was released in 95, and the second in 99. So, jumping to the 2000s, Shadow Watch 2000 is a video game adaptation of Tom Clancy's Power Plays novel of the same name, developed by Red Storm Entertainment. It has been compared to XCOM, though it features a different action point system and is missing the latter game's upgradable units. Game's reception was mixed. Fallout Tactics Brotherhood of Steel is a spin-off of the Fallout series by CRPGs by Interplay Entertainment, developed by Australian company Microforte. Unusual for the genre is the option to choose between real-time and turn-based combat, or between a continuous turn-based mode, individual turn-based mode, and squad turn-based modes that the developers put in. The game even allows the player to switch modes in the middle of play. The game received generally favorable reviews from critics, though was not as well received as the series' most traditional RPG titles. Soldiers of Anarchy is a squad-based real-time tactics computer game by German developer Silver Style Entertainment. Gameplay involves squad tactics, vehicles, blah blah. So, I've kind of noticed something already. Games that are strongly Western in this style, all war games, all pretty mixed, and nobody has much to say about it because it's just fighting. Like, there's nothing. So we're going to actually just skip all of the Western look because it gives us nothing. Yeah, all of it was just like, this game come out at this time. It was received in a mixed way. So, moving right along. Genre blurring. Other games combine similar mechanics, but typically belong in other genres. Tactical war games, such as the Steel Panthers series, sometimes combine tactical military combat with RPG-derived unit advancement. Avalon Hill's Squad Leader, a man-to-man war game utilizing the Soldiers at War engine, has also been compared, unfavorably, to XCOM and Jagged Alliance. Rebel Star and Laser Squad were precursors to XCOM created by the same developer, Julian Galop. They did not, however, feature the statistical character development and strategic map of the later series. Bokosuka Wars, a game regarded as the progenitor of the strategy simulation RPG genre, is also difficult to clearly define. While often referred to as a strategy simulation RPG, it is also sometimes referred to as a prototype real-time strategy, an early reverse tower defense game, and an early action role-playing game. Nobunaga's Ambition and later Koei titles, as well as Capcom's Destiny of an Emperor, have blurred the lines between a role-playing game, turn-based grand strategy war game, and simulation war video game. Similarly, Kure Software's Kobu Silver Ghost combine elements of both tactical RPGs and action RPGs, while Ogre Battle March of the Black Queen blurred the line between a tactical RPG and a real-time strategy. Metal Gear Acid blurs the line between a stealth game, a genre the Metal Gear series is normally known for, along with the tactical role-playing inspired by the likes of Final Fantasy and Fire Emblem, and fused with card gameplay found in games like Yu-Gi-Oh! In addition to a turn-based tactical combat layer, the XCOM series also possesses a real-time 3D strategic layer, complete with global defensive map, as well as technology tree that the player must research in order to unlock new weapon and armor. Jagged Alliance 2 features a country sector map with fortified towns and roving bands of enemies that must be defeated before entering the capital city of Meduna. Nights in the Nightmare combines elements of traditional tactical RPGs with bullet hell style shoot 'em up gameplay. So full-fledged CRPGs. A number of full-fledged computer role-playing games could also be described as having tactical combat. Examples from the classic era of CRPGs include parts of the aforementioned Ultima series, beginning with Ultima 3 Exodus, SSI's Wizard Crown, and the Eternal Dagger. The Realm of Arcania series based on the German The Dark Eye pen and paper system, and the Gold Box games of the late 80s and early 90s, many of which were later ported to Japanese video game systems. Other examples include Troika Games' The Temple of Elemental Evil, which features a highly accurate implementation of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 edition rule set, Knights of the Chalice, which implements the D20 open game license, and Pyrrhic, trying to spell this word, pronounce it Pyrrhic, Tales, Prelude to Darkness, an open world RPG featuring one continuous game world. More recent examples include Wasteland 2, Divinity Original Soul, and The Age of Decadence. Partly due to the success of Wasteland 2, Divinity Original Soul, Shadowrun, Dragonfall, Blackguards, and Dead State, 2014 has been labeled the year of the CRPG Renaissance. Tir na Nog is a series of role-playing video games that premiered in Japan on the PC-98 and later released for Windows. The latest title in the series is also being released for the PlayStation 2 and PSP. Heroes of Jin Yang, a Chinese role-playing game based on the popular historical wuxia novels of Jin Yang, features a number of melee and ranged kung fu skills to train and develop, as well as grid-based battle system. A remake of the game used the title Tale of Wuxia, was released in Chinese in 2015, and later on Steam in both Chinese and English in 2016. Several MMOs have combined multiplayer online gaming with tactical turn-based combat. Examples include Doofus, The Continuum, as well as the Russian game Total Influence Online. Tactica Online was a planned MMORPG that would have featured tactical combat had development not been cancelled. Gunrocks, Pox Nora, and Wakfu are some other recent examples. Many tactical RPGs can be both extremely time-consuming and extremely difficult, hence the appeal of most tactical RPGs to the hardcore, not casual, computer and video game player. Traditionally, tactical RPGs have been quite popular in Japan, but have not enjoyed the same degree of success in North America and elsewhere. However, the audience for Japanese tactical RPGs has grown substantially in the West since the mid-90s, with PS1 and PS2 titles such as Final Fantasy Tactics, Suikoden Tactics, Vanguard Bandits, and Disgaea, enjoying a surprising measure of popularity outside of Japan. Further, older Japanese tactical RPGs were also being re-released via software emulation, such as the Wii's Virtual Console, as well as on handheld systems, giving these games a new lease on life. However, in the 2000s, some developers complained that it was becoming increasingly difficult to develop games of this type, though several had been developed in Eastern Europe with limited success. And even some developers were beginning to complain about a supposed bias against turn-based systems. Reasons cited include publishers' focus on developing real-time, action-oriented games, as well as a perception that games with turn-based mechanics were too niche to become successful. But things may have turned around in 2010s, at least in the West. A few high-profile titles, such as 2K Games' strategy video games, XCOM, Enemy Unknown, and XCOM 2, as well as a number of Kickstarter-funded RPGs, such as Larian's Divinity Original Sin, In Exiles, Wasteland 2, and Harebrained Schemes' Shadowrun Returns, were successfully developed and published in recent years, in part due to new means of funding and distributing them. According to Dan Tudge of N-Space, the resurgence of tactical isometric RPGs has a lot to do with accessibility, changes in the ecosystem like Steam, and a digital distribution that has made it easier than ever for developers to connect with players. So, tactical RPGs is definitely something I have the least amount of experience with, simply because it's just never been something that I necessarily enjoyed playing growing up, but it's something I'm willing to look back on now and give them a try, especially with how much we've delved into like Final Fantasy and everything. So giving a couple of those games a try, maybe even trying out a Fire Emblem or two would be fun, assuming I can get my hands on them. But yeah, all of that would be pretty interesting for us to dive into. But that also means we have finally finished the role-playing genre, which means we've got the simulation genre starting next week, and then we've got strategy. So we've got simulation, strategy, sports, and then we've got other. Then we've got sandbox. Yeah, we've got a whole lot more. So don't worry, we're going nowhere. We've still got a long road ahead. Yes, it sounds fun to everybody, so that's good. Anyway, that is where we're going to be ending off this podcast for today. I hope you all enjoyed, and until the next time, everybody, stay funky, people.